All right, so Kim, you want to take over? This is your part.
Sure. Yeah, man, I just got here. I just got back in my house. I'm glad I could get here on time. Although I was going to lay low and see how you did as MC, but
it's a lot of pressure.
Welcome, Mark. Sorry I couldn't get on earlier to chat. I'll talk with you afterwards.
No worries.
Good. So yeah, we'll get started in about 1 minute here. Looks like there's still people logging on, so we'll give them a minute. Okay, cool. So let's get started. So we're welcome Marc Melitz here today to talk about moving parts. Keith is in the chat room, I understand, to answer questions. If you'd like to ask questions in the chat, he can get to them. But otherwise, just unmute yourself and jump in like you would in a regular seminar, and then we'll have time at the end for more discussion and questions.
Yeah,
Mark,
I just remembered that I was supposed to put the slides in the chat, and I didn't. Actually,
did you send a copy to Roman?
I did not send. I did not send a copy to him, and now I've lost my my chat window.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Got it. Okay. Cool.
Yep. I think I can. Do this. Here we go.
Yeah. Perfect. We can see you. Great. Yeah. Right. So you can get started, Mark. You have an hour.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. And as Kim was just mentioning, so this is a joint work with Keith Head and Thierry Maillard. So let me just give you a brief outline. So this is I'm gonna start with a theoretical model for thinking about rules of origin within a regional trade agreement, and kind of motivate this idea that when you're sourcing a lot of parts, and in the model it'll be a continuum, there's these very strong forces that generate a Laffer curve effect for rules of origin. I'll talk much more about that later. And then I'm going to introduce some data that we have, and the data is going to be entirely focused on the auto industry, and it's going to be not only focused on the auto industry, but it's going to be sourcing decisions for some key parts, in particular engines and transmissions. And then I'm going to show you some empirical results that are related to that, and talk about the connections back to the model. And then you'll see there's one, I'll talk about kind of one missing section in the paper, which is then using those estimates to do a much more detailed calibration of the model. So there's this big question about what level, what is the right level for the rules of origin. Just to be clear here, we're not going to do any kind of welfare analysis, so it's going to be a competitive model. I'm not going to introduce any kind of distortions. So I'm going to think entirely about the impact of the rule of origins on, we can think of it as employment, or in terms of the model, it's going to be the source of parts that are going to be produced within the regional trade agreement. In any event, if you kind of see the news related to negotiations on rule of origins, it seems like the people doing that negotiations are entirely focused on these types of employment effects. In particular, we're going to show you some experiments, some counterfactuals that are going to be related to this very big change in rules of origin in the renegotiation of NAFTA, now the new USMCA, with a rather drastic increase in those rules of origin. So clearly, kind of, if you take some quotes from the people involved in that, the idea was that there's this monotonic relationship in which, when you crank up the rules of origin, you keep increasing the share of parts that are going to be produced within the RTA. And this is why we're going to go to a theoretical model to show that that is not the case. And in fact, as you keep increasing the restrictiveness of the rule of origin, in fact, there's going to be this Laffer curve effect that then means that stricter rules of origin are going to move part production out of the regional trade agreement. So I'm going to spend some time showing this the theoretical model. I think I talked. This is all part of everything that was in the outline. I'll show you some counterfactuals that will be specifically related to NAFTA. Although the model is really about thinking about rules of origins much more generally. And then the part of it that's still missing that I'll just talk about at the end and would definitely love to hear some more discussion about is where we're planning to go using the empirical estimates that I'll show you to calibrate the full model. So in the empirical estimates, we'll have data just on engines and transmissions. And we want to go back to thinking about how we can do some counterfactuals that are not just going to involve engines and transmission sourcing, but the whole range of automotive parts. So let me just show you one part of the data. This is actually not our main set of data. This is publicly available data. This is based on this Automobile Labeling Act. So if you've ever bought a car in the US, you've seen that sticker on the side window that gives you some information about where the car was assembled and where the key parts were coming from. So this is, by the way, for cars sold in the US and Canada. And so we've downloaded that data. There's some issue about data quality related to that. And again, to be clear, we're not going to use this part of the data in our main empirical analysis. The main point I want to make is just related to this counterfactual to the change in the restrictiveness in the rules of origin, that this is a very important policy that is going to have some substantial bite. So kind of what you see here are cumulative distributions for part shares. Actually, they're cost shares of parts for these vehicles sold in the US and Canada. You see the old level of the NAFTA rule of origin and the new one that is part of the new NAFTA. And the whole point I want to make here is if you go from the old to the new along these CDFs, we're talking about a very substantial share of cars that are no longer going to be compliant. Also, something to be clear: these distributions here are one observation is one car model. In the data, we have exact data for volumes, and the volume of cars, the CDFs are shifted way over to the right, which is to say that the cars that are sold in the US that have some of the highest volumes are ones that source a lot of their parts within NAFTA. But I think this is still informative to say that there are going to be a whole bunch of car models that are sold in the US that are no longer going to be compliant with the new NAFTA rule. And then the other part I wanted to highlight is there's this tremendous amount of heterogeneity depending on where the car is produced and also who the maker of the car is. So you can kind of see these are for German cars produced in NAFTA. You see that that's clearly shifted over to the left, that those cars use substantially more parts from outside of NAFTA. For these German car brands, it's going to be parts coming from Europe. And the same is true for cars that are assembled in Mexico. And then again, just this is the one part of the graph here that's not related to production in the US. Here you see the German cars that the German brands that are made outside of the US and Canada and Mexico, outside of NAFTA. And you see just clearly how shifted over that is, that those cars use very, very little NAFTA made parts.
Mark,
yeah.
Sorry, if I understand the graphs correctly, they are a cross section, right? They're describing the distribution
cross section. Yeah. Yeah.
And what you're after is how these distributions will change when you change the incentives.
Well, the model is going to capture that model is going to capture that. This is just to make the point that this change, I'll show you at the end some counterfactuals for going to a very restrictive rule of origin for NAFTA, that this is going to have substantial bite. It's not as if basically the CDFs were such that they were very flat here and very high here. Most of the cars are compliant. It's
Right.
not a particularly interesting counterfactual to look at. That's just a point I want to
Okay, and these data are from before or after?
This is all before. I mean, this was just from last year. We don't have post USMCA data.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Mark, just a quick question. So, I mean, the tariffs on following these rules of origin means that you don't have to pay tariffs on stuff moving within NAFTA, right?
Yes.
I mean, the tariffs on cars probably are pretty low within NAFTA either way, but is that true? So this shouldn't, people can just choose not to
Exactly.
produce.
Exactly. Yeah. So and that's going to be a very big part of the model where you can just choose not to comply. And clearly, if this data is to be believed, there's a whole bunch of cars that are non-compliant. We're looking at getting some additional source on just direct source on compliance to make sure that this matches. But you're absolutely right. If you're non-compliant, you're going to get hit with for cars. You're going to get hit with a 2.5% tariff. So that it's not a huge tariff. If we included pickup trucks, then it would be huge, right? Then that's the 25% one. But 2.5% is still a significant penalty to pay. And as you'll see, this is what we have in the model. Firms may choose to pay that tariff and not comply with the rule of origin.
Okay.
And that's going to be a key thing that generates the Laffer curve. Yeah.
And the pickup truck tariff is really just on importing into the U.S., right? So
no, it would apply to, for example, so it applies, for example, to cars that are assembled in Mexico and Canada and sold in the U.S. If they're not compliant, then they're going to get hit with.
Yeah, but it's just the stuff that's coming to the U.S. It's not stuff coming from the U.S.
exactly,
to,
and
to
that's
Mexico or Canada.
Yes, exactly, and I'll talk
Gotcha.
very briefly about the extension. I mean, most of the intuition we can do without the choice of assembly location. But essentially, I'll show you how when we endogenize the assembly location, which empirically is crucial, when you choose to not comply, it's not just that you're not going to comply and keep the assembly where it is.
Right.
A lot of car manufacturers are going to have an incentive to start assembling outside of NAFTA, and they'll incur the tariff either way.
Okay.
Mark, another clarifying question is, and the y-axis is in values or just number of cars?
This is the CDF model by model, not adjusted by car volumes.
Thank you.
Right, that's what I was saying. When you adjust it by car volumes, they shift over to the right.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Oops, I'm going backwards here.
Sorry, Mark, when you don't comply, is it kind of a 0-1 thing, or is it just, there's a little bit of parts you have to pick?
No, it's a 0-1. It's a 0-1 thing. You get
so
hit.
It's kind of surprising there's not more of a kind of jump up right at the.
Well, actually, we think there is a lot of math, right? Right at that tip, especially when you do weighted by volume. But that is what you would expect, yes. And we'll see that in the definitely in the model. All right, so let me go. Let me go through the model here. This is just going to be a competitive Eden quorum model within the firm. So very similar to the work that Paul and Felix and Teresa have done. We're not going to have, for now, the fixed costs and increasing returns to scale at the level of the firm, but we are going to have this endogenous assembly location choice, which I'll show you at the very end. But just to fix idea, I'm mostly going to just motivate the model in figures, but just to kind of give you a little bit of notation. So the model is just very stripped down, just to give you this intuition for this Laffer curve effect. There are going to be two countries, home and foreign. The costs are going to be, these EK draws. So in terms of the cost, they're going to be Weibull cost draws. And there's going to be this parameter delta, which is going to be a parameter for the firm, which is going to capture comparative advantage. So your cost is going to be 1 at home, and it's going to be delta in if the part is produced in foreign. And so delta less than 1 means the firm has a cost advantage in sourcing the parts abroad. Delta greater than 1, the firm has a cost advantage of sourcing in home. So we can derive essentially what the unrestricted share of domestically sourced parts are. I think a lot of you will see, recognize these formulas. I'm going to motivate everything graphically. Let me just just tell you briefly how we think about the rule of origin. So we model the rules of origin as if there was a tariff that the firm was being hit on for its parts. Except that the firm, that tariff revenue comes right back to the firm. So the tariff is just going to induce the firm to progressively source more and more parts at home away from foreign. And we're going to essentially think of the rule of origin as an implicit tariff that would induce that share of parts being produced at home and then give the revenue back to the firm. So we're modeling basically a tariff at the level of the firm, just like we do at the level of the country, where the revenue comes back to the country, and what we're left is just the pure distortion effect of the policy. But that's going to be very important. And from here on out, I'll show you everything in terms of the rule of origin, which is going to be chi-r, even though in the model we solve it through by thinking about what is the tariff on parts that would induce that share of parts sourced domestically. Okay, and then here are the resulting cost shares. So the main thing I kind of want to focus on is what is a cost penalty that a rule of origin chi-r is going to induce, which is this term right here. By what percentage is it going to increase your cost? Okay, and so this, I'm just going to show it graphically. So this is what we have here. So we see that it's going to clearly vary by comparative advantage for the firm. So a firm that has foreign cost advantage, this cost penalty is going to be substantially higher than it is for a firm that has a home production cost advantage. Two things that I want to point out with this graph is these curves have a lot of convexity, and they're very different than the cost penalty that would arise from an iceberg trade cost. Or kind of put another way, if you can think of this as, instead of just an input EK within the firm, you can think of this as a standard two-country idem quorum model. You could think about these costs as the welfare, instead of the gains from trade, the welfare losses from protection. But they're very different for a tariff that is a pure distortion than they are for an iceberg cost. So if I showed you this on a log-log scale and we did just iceberg cost, then we would get that standard, the standard ACR formula that on log-log scale, it would just be purely linear in the iceberg trade cost. If I showed you this on the log-log scale, it would still have a lot of convexity, which is basically saying that when you first, and kind of we see that here, that when you first introduce the rule of origin and first becomes binding, the slope here is 0, which is this envelope theorem that it's just a pure distortion effect. There's no direct cost associated with that. But the slope is going to significantly increase even in terms of its elasticity. So its elasticity is going to continuously increase. So that's kind of one point. And this convexity is going to be a key component that's going to generate this Laffer curve effect. The other thing that you can see is if I had shown you a firm that had even a stronger home comparative advantage at home, so an even higher delta, you would see that the curve here would end up entirely below the tariff line, or I could have shown you a higher tariff line, and then this yellow firm would have been entirely below. So what that's saying is even if you go to the max restrictiveness for rule of origin, there are some firms that are still always going to comply with the rule of origin. They're still going to incur a cost associated with that, but there's going to be a subset of firms that are always going to comply with any rule of origin, and that's going to be important later when I discuss the Laffer curve. So let me show you what this compliance decision looks like as a function here. So now I'm showing you on the horizontal axis this key delta parameter across firms. So we see that the firms on the left, and you see the same relative cost penalty curve here, just as a function of the firm's delta. So clearly for the firms for whom the cost penalty is above the tariff, they're just going to choose to be non-compliant. In this simple model, nothing's going to happen to the assembly location decision, when we endogenize the assembly location decision, these firms are going to be very likely to also be moving assembly away from home. And I'll show you that in a few minutes. This is kind of the goal of the rule of origin, which is to force firms to comply by raising their part share. So these firms are going to be constrained by the rule of origin. They're going to increase their domestic share of parts because the cost of doing so is below the cost of the tariff. And then finally, there's going to be a subset of firms that have such a strong comparative advantage for producing parts, sourcing parts within at home, that they're not going to be affected by the rule of origin. The rule of origin is a min, it's not a max. And so the firms are going to be above that and they're going to comply, but they're still going to be unconstrained. So what's going to happen to the regional content share, the part share? So this is kind of the key thing, that from a policy perspective, the rule of origin is meant to increase. It's meant to induce these firms to comply with the rule of origin and increase the share of parts that they source at home. So we see this region where there is going to be this effect. And so there's going to be this jump where a firm, instead of using its unconstrained part share, it's going to jump and use the part share that is mandated by the rule of origin. In this case, I'm just showing you an example where it's 70%. But at either end, there are going to be some firms that are going to comply regardless, so they're not affected by the rule of origin. And then the really important part is at this other end here are going to be firms that are going to choose not to comply with the rule of origin. They go back to using their unrestricted share. And again, as I motivated before, when you endogenize assembly location choice, these are also the firms that may be induced to move location from home to foreign. So I'm showing you now, showing you something aggregating over a bunch of different firms. I'm picking a log normal distribution for the delta. So I'm setting the mu at 0. So that's basically saying that on average, the firms neither have a comparative advantage or disadvantage at home. The mean is going to be 1. And the sigma of 0.2 just tells us that, you know, one standard deviation up from the median firm is a 20% cost advantage in favor of either home going in one direction or foreign going in the other direction. And so kind of theoretically, what you can show is clearly as you increase the rule of origin, you're going to increase the firms that are going to choose to just not comply with the rule of origin. And fewer firms are going to be compliant unconstrained. That means at some point, the rule of origin is going to bind for a greater share of firms. And then those firms that do jump up and increase their sourcing from home is going to be sandwiched in the middle. And the shape of this is going to be very dependent on the shape of the distribution we use. I'll show you a bunch of different examples for changing the shape under this assumption of a normal distribution for the percent cost advantage or disadvantage. This is going to be hump shaped. And then in particular, notice that here the curve ends here at 17%. So in this simulation right here, 17% of firms will always comply with the rule of origin. That is, you crank the rule of origin all the way to the max, which is kind of sending the country into autarky. We still have 17% of the firms that are going to comply. Okay, so now here's the first impact of just kind of showing you how this leads to a Laffer curve. So what I'm showing you is the part share now as a function of the rule of origin, and we see it here in blue for all firms, and then in yellow excluding the always compliers. So clearly, if you have a lot of firms that are always going to comply with the rule of origin, you get a monotonic prediction for what happens to the part share as you crank up the rule of origin, right? The firms are always going to comply. And so for those firms, you increase the rule of origin, you're always going to increase the share of parts that are sourced from home. So what we can show theoretically, and this doesn't depend on whatever distribution, shape of distribution that you use, is that if you exclude those firms that are always going to comply, then you are necessarily going to get a Laffer curve in the sense that this Laffer curve here is always going to start at a particular level and end at the same level. And in between, it's going to increase and then decrease. Now, depending, you could have a very weird distribution for the deltas where this wouldn't be single humped. But regardless of the distribution, it's going to first initially increase, and then at a certain point, it's going to be decreasing. So this idea that there is a range of being on this backward bending part of the Laffer curve where you crank up the rule of origin and you actually induce car manufacturers to actually start sourcing more parts outside of home, outside of the RTA, is always going to be there. Now, of course, this is in kind of theory. One big part that we want to do is use our data to figure out exactly where this backward bending part of the Laffer curve is for the auto industry. So I just wanted to show you kind of what this Laffer curve looks like under a bunch of different assumptions for the deltas and the mu's. Again, our goal is that the deltas and the mu's are going to be pinned down by what we have in the data, but just showing you this kind of theoretically for now is quite intuitive. If we change the mean for the comparative advantage, so we give home more of a cost advantage, we see clearly that there's going to be a higher source of home sourced parts. And conversely, as we move from the yellow to the blue to the green, and we give more of a cost advantage in the distribution to foreign, we see this entire share shifting down. The important part here is that you still just get the same shape of the Laffer curve. And then same thing if we change the variance of these delta draws that go in the direction that you would have, that is intuitive, which is, you know, a tighter hump here if we have lower variance in this distribution of the deltas. You can also think about changing the theta parameter from the Fréchet productivity, or inversely the Weibull cost draws. And again, it goes in the same direction as anticipated. And here you see it for different levels of theta. Again, theta is something that we're going to be able to measure pretty well in the data, because we're going to have a lot of variation that's going to be based on a very good cost measure, which are going to be tariffs, either tariffs on engines or transmissions, or tariffs on final vehicles. And again, you see that you can use different tariff levels. And even in this example, if you use a tariff of 2.5%, clearly it changes where the peak of the Laffer curve is. You still get this Laffer curve effect. So it's really just this empirical question about where the auto industry is. For example, if we're thinking about 2.5% and NAFTA, the key question is for production, and this is mainly for assembly in Mexico and in Canada that ships a lot of cars to the US that are going to be hit by this tariff. What is the empirical shape of this Laffer curve? So let me just briefly motivate the extension to an endogenous assembly choice. All that's going to happen now is when the firm chooses not to comply, it's going to have a choice of either it's going to not comply and keep its assembly at home, or it's not going to comply and do assembly in foreign. The lower is delta, the comparative advantage related to foreign production, the more the firm is going to be likely, when it doesn't comply, to not comply and shift assembly location in foreign. I should add, of course, that trade costs here are going to be critical. I should have mentioned this before. In the simple version I showed you now, we didn't have any trade costs, although in the version without the choice of assembly, trade costs and delta are isomorphic. So you could have thought that if you wanted to think about the impact of trade cost without the choice of assembly location, it's exactly the same thing as changing the delta. Now with endogenous location choice, the trade cost matter. So in the model, we model the trade cost directly, and then you get this effect that I was just mentioning, which is the low delta firms now are, when they choose to not comply, they're not going to comply, and they're going to assemble in foreign. And so kind of what you get in terms of the Laffer curve is this is the Laffer curve without the endogenous assembly. And this is the same one with the assembly location choice. So essentially what you get is you get firms that are you get firms that are not only sourcing their parts using their unrestricted share, but, and again, here the trade costs are going to matter for the parts. They're also going to choose to move assembly to foreign. And when they do that, because of their trade costs, they're going to be much more likely to source a whole bunch more of their parts in foreign instead of in home, which is why you see this much bigger effect. And again, because of this effect, we see that the negative effect now doesn't just, if we, with the always complying firms, you don't go right back to where you started. Not only do you just go back to where you started, you actually can end up significantly worse than not having any rule of origin at all. So with assembly location, too restrictive a rule of origin is not just that it can kind of reduce employment relative to having a less restrictive one. It can actually make you worse off than having no rule of origin at all. And this is just for the part share. This is not even looking at what's happening to assembly employment, right? So that would be an additional negative impact, that when the firms don't comply and they move assembly from home to foreign, in addition to that, there's going to be a decrease in the assembly employment.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
So relocating these assembly plants is a really big decision. These are huge investments. I would have thought that it might be easier to relocate some of the parts manufacturers before thinking about moving these assembly plants. Do you have some sense on like how that might, shift these lines in some way? I mean, I could see like, an engine, or I don't know what gets made where, but I could see that kind of maybe working in a slightly different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we see evidence of that in the data. Although, so what we're going to do, what we do in this project is we do that, but only kind of using cross-sectional data, right? Which is going to build, which still builds in these dynamic decisions of the firm. You could also think of using the data in a different direction, which is kind of looking over time at what happens. But I'll show you, there's clearly what we see is we see that the firms tend to kind of locate the parts close to kind of where the assembly location is.
Yeah.
We see that they're willing to incur a much wider kind of distribution of recovered cost for kind of assembly than they are for parts, which is basically saying if it gets too big for parts, they kind of move the location of the parts production. So that's kind of built in, but we're just going to assume that we kind of see a cross section that reflects that is kind of averaging out those dynamic decisions that the firms are making.
Sorry, Mark, can I
Yeah.
ask a question real quick?
Yeah, of course.
So my understanding is it's pretty easy to retool a plant to move, intensive margins across borders. Are you thinking about these being big, extensive margin type movements where you're picking up a plant and moving it, or like, can we think of this as more a fluid adjustment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it's kind of, I'll show you kind of what we do with the data, and what we're going, actually, this is what we're going to move towards, is we're going to allow these decisions to be made at the intensive margin. And this is going to be essentially part of our discrete choice specification for kind of where do you source your engine and transmission from. And again, if you're selling vehicles in a particular country, which assembly location do you want to use? And kind of built into that, was going to build the idea that even if we don't observe a flow, we want to say, well, that's possible. You could have sourced your engine from this location, right? So that's something we're going to build into our discrete choice framework. I'm going to kind of tell you what decision we made. We're spending a lot of time thinking about how, looking at sensitivity related to that and thinking about what metrics we should use to exactly evaluate what that margin should be. And then just to be clear, one extensive margin that we're not going to capture, again, this goes back to my response to George, is we're not going to assume, we're not going to use in the truther set to say, well, you could build a whole new engine plant in this location here. All right, so we're going to use the existing distribution of engine plants, but we're going to estimate a framework where firms could source their engines from different engine plants that in the data we see kind of the firm using. And I'll be very clear about what those extensive margin decisions we allow for in the estimation.
Thanks.
Mark, since we're asking applied questions now, pardon my ignorance, but the car manufacturers have the rules of origin as a minimum value added that has to be sourced within NAFTA.
Yes.
Correct? So
Yep.
it may be that the car manufacturer can choose whether it's going to do the engines or the gears or
Yes,
whatever.
absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then does it create weird incentives if the firm is close to the threshold? I know that in your model it's continuous, but in reality it's not. So you may want to pay your local supplier, overpay him a little just to meet that rules of origin.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why kind of just if we just do, well, the only one I'll show you today is kind of counterfactual where I have to take a stand on that. And we only have data on engines and transmission. So the counterfactual has to be, what if I force you to source your engine and transmission within NAFTA, right? What is precisely what we want to use the model for is to say, well, we understand that you can make different decisions about these different parts. And that's where we want to take our estimates from the data for just engines and transmissions and put them into the model so that we can capture this kind of substitution decision about different types of parts. And that's a part that's that missing section that we haven't done yet.
Okay, thanks.
So let me just give you a little bit of information on the data. This data that we have. So for every car that is assembled and sold anywhere in the world, we see where the car is assembled. We see where the exact location of the assembly plant. We see the destination of final sale as a country. So we see what country it's going to. And then in terms of the supply chain, we see all the flows for every car model that is produced. We have what plant did the engine come from? What plant did the transmission come from for all of these models? And so we have kind of exact geography for the plant-to-plant flow for the engine and the transmission to the assembly plant, and then from the assembly plant to a country destination. And so we have this for every car that's produced in the world between 2000 and 2018. Those are the years we're going to use and the estimates I'm going to show you. We have a lot of details on the type of car that it's produced, exactly what model car is being produced, and exactly what engine and transmission is being mounted on there. What's the horsepower, what's the fuel type, torque, speed, design, etc. So here you see kind of some numbers that are going to, these are just for in-house. So this is just to motivate to that this is not something we address in our model. We do have controls for this empirically about the boundary of the firm. But if you know a little bit about the car industry, you know that a lot of these big parts like the engine and transmission are predominantly made in-house. And you see that for NAFTA, and for engines, it's really dominant. 97% of them are in-house. It's lower for transmissions because there are some highly specialized third-party transmission producers that make transmissions for producers for assemblers around the world. And then you see the same percentages that are definitely lower, but still very substantial for cars that are assembled in the EU. And then kind of some little bit of data. I'm going to show you much more data about the median distance that an engine travels and a transmission travels. You see that there's a big difference in terms of transmissions being sourced from much, much further away. Although I'll show you in the estimates that we get from our discrete choice models that the parameters are actually quite stable, whether we look at engines or we look at transmissions. So
Mark,
let me,
just to pursue Cecilia's point, given that so much of this is done in-house, and I think you said that these ROOs are stated in value terms, doesn't this mean that the enforcer has to rely on some internal pricing?
Yes, absolutely. So they do have to rely on that. I mean, this is not a subject. So when I should go to the model, essentially our empirical framework is one that's going to assume cost minimization. So it's just going to assume that we're not going to deal with any kind of issue related to markup. So we're just going to assume that the number of cars sold in a particular, demanded in a particular destination is not going to change. And we're just going to ask the question about sourcing. Where do you want to source assembly? And conditional on assembly, where do you want to get your engine and your transmission from? And as I was saying, in this part of it, we're not going to address this issue of kind of cost shares or part shares. When we take that to the data, that's where we're going to use the model, which we have kind of direct measures for, and we're going to assume, maybe getting to your question, that it's just kind of truthful reporting of cost shares, although there may be incentives to distort those. Yeah.
Fair enough.
So let me kind of give you, motivate this discrete choice framework by just appealing to a particular example. So think about a Beetle convertible that's assembled in Mexico. One point I want to make is just about single sourcing, and I'll come back to this example later. If we just use plant-to-plant trade flows, and we ask, look, if we look at this particular production assembly plant, how many engine plants are sending engines over to that assembly plant? How many transmission plants are sending transmissions to that assembly plant? It would look like there's a fair amount, not a huge amount, but a fair amount of multi-sourcing. If we take it down to the model specific and we ask for the Beetle, how many plants are sending engines, how many plants are sending transmission, we would still see some multi-sourcing. But when we go to the level of detail that's relevant, and we have this, which is to say, look, if it's a Beetle that has a gas engine and a manual transmission, where do you buy your where do you get your manual transmission from? Where do you get your engine from? It's almost exclusively single sourcing. Okay, and the only amount of that isn't single sourcing are transition years where the assembler is transitioning from one source for its engine to another source of its engine. And so this is why we feel comfortable with our discrete choice framework, that you choose one location for your engines, you choose one location for your transmission, conditional on this very important distinction of, you can buy your gas engines from one plant and your diesel engines from another plant. And in fact, for the Beetle, which is this example right here, this is exactly what we see happen. So here's my example. Here's a platform that it's built on, and the platform is going to be important exactly for motivating these extensive margin decisions that I was just talking about earlier. So it's built on a particular platform. And let me see if I can try to motivate our the decisions we made about this discrete choice framework in this graph. So what you see here is you see the Puebla, Mexico plant, which is assembling that Beetle. As I was mentioning, it gets its gas engines from a plant in Mexico. It gets its diesel engine from Hungary. It's manual transmission from Barcelona. It's automatic transmissions from Japan. And we see all the other Volkswagen assembly plants that are built on the same platform. And this is going to be an important part of kind of what we put in our chooser set. What flexibility are we going to give to the firm to kind of switch where it can source its engines and where it could source its transmissions from? And so the key kind of decision we're going to make is that this is going to happen at the platform level. So what we're going to say is, look, you can source a manual transmission for the Beetle. You can source it from any plant that is sending transmissions, automatic transmissions, for the case of automatic transmissions, to a platform that is shared by this Beetle, right? So any car that is using the same platform, whether it's a Passat, the Q3, the Caddy, in some years, the Golf and the Jetta have also used that same platform. If I see any of those buying an automatic transmission for that platform from a particular plant, I'm going to assume that Volkswagen could source its automatic transmissions from that plant, right? And then the same thing is going to be, we're going to assume for engines. I'll show you a little bit of the equations for our discrete choice specification. So I is going to be the engine location. K is going to be the transmission location. L is going to be the chooser here. So in this case, it's going to be the Beetle convertible, either manual or automatic or diesel or gas that is assembled in Puebla, Mexico. And then there's going to be the choice of the assembly location choice. So we're going to think about, from the point of view of a destination country N, where do I want to source my, the assembly of that Beetle convertible? And I'm going to make the same assumption that I could source it anywhere where I see a car on the same platform being assembled. So kind of to put this
Mark,
in.
sorry, can you go back to the diagram, please, just to understand
Sure.
it well? If the firm is in Puebla, so look at the Beetle in Puebla. If it's selling in the US, that's when, if it complies to the rules of origin, then it has that deduction in tariffs. But if it sells anywhere else, then the meeting the rules of origin is irrelevant. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how about the
yes. And I should have said in our baseline specification, we're going to assume that the rules of origin don't bind. And I'll show you kind of some data. Actually, I kind of pulled it out because there were just too many regression columns, but I'll claim that kind of doing some filtering for cases where we know the rule of origins not to bind, that we don't see any major changes in the coefficients that we estimate. But you're right that this has to apply to a case where the rule of origin is not binding. So for this empirical example, I want to think about VW making this example, making these decisions without worrying about the rule of origin.
Okay.
We're going to recover the coefficients, and then we're going to do counterfactuals to say, well, what if we forced VW to source its diesel its engines and transmissions within NAFTA? Okay.
And then the last question is, how do the tariffs on the inputs apply?
Well, they're going to be a big part of the decision of the Puebla, Mexico plant to source, because the engines are going to be hit with different tariffs depending on whether they come locally from Mexico or whether they come from Hungary, and we have data on that.
And whether they comply or not to the rules of origin.
Well, for the tariffs on engines, it doesn't matter.
It's going to be the same.
Yeah, that's where it does matter is for the tariffs on vehicles. But I'll show you that the coefficient we recover on the tariff on vehicles is stable to those assumptions that we make.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, to excluding ones where the rule of origin can be binding. So in the nested logit kind of language, so the chooser here, this is actually repeating what I showed you in the graph, right? Who the chooser is, what the choice is. So in stage one, you choose where you get your engine, where you get your transmission. In stage 2, you choose where the vehicle is going to be assembled according to kind of those, what's in the chooser set that I just described. So here you get a little bit of the idea of the dimension of the data. So on average, given these decisions that I've motivated, we're giving the firm, the assembly plant, a choice of 6 alternatives for the engine, 3 for the transmission. Vehicle sourcing, of course, it's country and by the detailed model. So we have many more observations. Because we're essentially estimating a nested logit, but because we have fixed effects, we can actually run this as Poisson maximum likelihood estimate, but you can just think of this as a nested logit specification. Here are the nested logit probabilities. So we're going to estimate the probability that L, that Beetle assembler, is going to choose a particular engine plant in country I. We're going to have fixed effects for the origin countries. We're going to have data on the tariffs that I was just, which are here, that I was just talking to Cecilia about. Various measures of distance. For now, we just have the plant-to-plant distance, but we're going to incorporate many other kind of bilateral distances, for example, involving the headquarters of the brand and some other data which we haven't yet done. And then in the second stage, you can think of that either as just an additional discrete choice specification that looks exactly the same. If you think of it in terms of the nested logit specification, we're going to include our recovered measure of expected cost for engines and transmissions as an additional regressor in the decision to source from a particular assembly plant. And we recover the expected cost in kind of the standard way from this logit specification. We have fixed effects by destination. I'll show you kind of some data that are associated with that. And so we use distance and data on tariffs for now. So these are the results of the engine and transmission sourcing decisions. We see that distance is, all the coefficients are highly significant. We do see this effect that I was telling you before, that we see that the effective distance is a little lower for transmission than it is for engines, although the coefficients are not hugely different. We do see this effect that there's much more within firm sourcing for engines and for transmissions. We see that there's a huge impact for NAFTA, that firms have a tendency to source their parts within NAFTA. The other coefficients, basically when we exclude, so this is what I have here, we can basically exclude any of the sourcing decisions that involved a within NAFTA flow. And we can also exclude, just because other RTAs also have rules of origin, we could also exclude any kind of chooser where rules of origin are likely to bind by basically looking at how much of the plant's auto production is sold within the RTA, but outside of its country, in which case a rule of origin would be binding. And so we use different thresholds by saying, well, we're going to throw it out if you have more than 25, if you have 25%, and then we go to kind of 10%, 5%, 1%, where you virtually have none that's going within the RTA, but outside of the country. And our remaining coefficients are very stable to those specifications. And in particular, so here's where we use the input tariff. We get very precise estimates for something that we can basically use to estimate we can use as a measure of this key parameter theta for the Fréchet draws, which is we see the variation that the tariffs on engines or transmission induces in terms of changing the probability of sourcing your engine from one location relative to another. Having this estimate based on a direct cost measure is also very important, just purely for the empirical work, because it allows us to translate all of the effects of these other regressors into basically direct cost measures. So we can ask a question, 1 mile of extra distance, what effect does that have on your sourcing probability compared to a 1% increase in the tariff, which we know to increase your cost by 1%. And this is also what allows us to recover expected cost measures from this sourcing decision. Let me show you just one piece of data that comes out of it. So this is just for the fixed country effects, normalized to be 1 for the US. You see countries above that have cost advantages relative to the US, and you kind of see their size. And you see countries to the right that have cost disadvantages relative to the US. There's a lot more that I could say about this, but I see that I'm starting to run low on time, and I really want to talk about the counterfactual. So I'm just kind of, with my apologies, I'm going to kind of go a little bit faster here, and I'm happy to go back to these and kind of answer any detailed questions later. We have the second stage decision, which is where you're going to source your assembly location from. And again, here we use the vehicle tariff to estimate that. We have a similar coefficient for distance. Again, kind of the within NAFTA effect is significant, and we can kind of use that to recover the same measures of for the fixed effects relative to the US for assembly in some countries. So you see again above the US here, and hopefully you can still see what countries these are relative to ones that have costs that are higher relative to the US. Again, I should have said this before, but it's the same thing that applies here. Critically, we use this coefficient that we recover on the tariff to be able to convert our country fixed effect into a cost measure. And these cost measures are going to be very relevant for the counterfactual. So in the few minutes I have left, I want to show you the counterfactual we can directly do from the data, and then talk, well, we've been talking a little bit too about like what we can do then to take this back to calibrate our theoretical model and model the rules of origins much more explicitly. So the counterfactuals that we have in mind is basically to say, okay, what if we reduced the set of choices for NAFTA producers to say, you can only now choose an engine and a transmission that is produced in NAFTA. What effect is that going to have on expected cost that we recover? And ultimately, and I'm not going to show you numbers on that, is that going to then translate into a probability that you choose a different assembly location for that car? So we recover kind of the expected cost. I kind of showed you this on the logit probability slide in the same way. Again, it's key that we have these very good coefficients for the effect of the tariff, which allow us to translate everything into cost percentages. And so this is kind of the final thing that I wanted to show you, which is now we can do these counterfactuals just based on the data. Now, of course, I can't think about, well, what's a 60% rule of origin? What's a 75% rule of origin? We're going to need the data for that. But what I can show you is if you forced the NAFTA assemblers to source engines and transmissions within NAFTA, what would be the percentage cost increase that would entail? And so you see the estimates here. We can't estimate this effect for some of them. So when you see an infinite effect here, it's basically saying the way we've defined our chooser set, BMW has no possibility of sourcing an engine and transmission within NAFTA. Of course, we can kind of expand the chooser set. We would still estimate a relatively high cost. Another alternative we could make is to say, well, you know, for BMW, it's likely to be similar to what we see other car manufacturers, German car manufacturers in NAFTA, in particular for Volkswagen and for Daimler, for ones where they do have some possibility of producing engines and transmissions within NAFTA. The clear thing that comes out of this, right, is that the cost penalties are very small for the US car producers that we see kind of at the bottom. They are in the middle for the Japanese and Korean producers, Compass is, these are Infinity cars that are being assembled in Mexico. And much higher essentially for the European car manufacturers. I don't know if you want to consider Renault Nissan to be European or Japanese. It's actually kind of right here in the middle, but you kind of see that there's this clear demarcation between the types of brands that are being assembled in the US. And you see these kind of very substantial increases in costs for kind of engines and transmissions that are associated with forcing you to source within NAFTA. And so just for the empirical part, and I say I'm running out of time, so let me just kind of, I'll end here. So for the empirical part, we can translate these cost percentages into probabilities that you're going to change assembly location, which is going to be very likely, for example, for these German car manufacturers. Still quite possible for the Japanese brands. And then we're going to use the estimates that we recover from that, and I'm happy to talk more about our ideas on this later on. We're going to use the estimates that we recover here from these nested logit specifications to get good estimates for the parameters in the theoretical model, and that we can kind of go back to this Laffer curve and say, well, what is that shape of the Laffer curve? Where is the backward bending part of it in terms of a sourcing percentages? And we can do much more precise counterfactuals than this extreme version, which says, I'm just going to force you to source the two parts that we observe in our data from within the RTA. So I see that I'm kind of out of time here. I realize I went quite fast on the empirical part of it. I have no idea how I'm going to present this once we have our structural, the structural version of the model with some data. But I'll just stop here and open it up for discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marc. So yeah, go ahead. Anna Cecilia, you look like you're ready to jump in. Go for it.
I was just clapping.
Oh, you were
I asked
clapping.
enough
Sorry, that was a
questions
hand raise.
during the talk.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, anybody with questions to go ahead, just jump in.
Marc,
Hey.
somehow I was feeling this is quite neat, I think. And I was just remembering I was at the Bank of Mexico visiting when in the early renegotiations of NAFTA, and somehow I felt like they argued that for a lot of outside of automobiles, it's kind of like they would just go to hell with it with this rules of origin and say, we'll just pay the tariffs. But that would just be an extreme version of what you're saying, I guess, which is that, then you have no leverage at all. They'll just get the inputs wherever they want to.
Exactly.
So I was thinking, in some sense, you're taking a conservative view in terms of this Laffer curve effect. If you can show it for automobiles, then it's should be pretty convincing, I would say, more generally. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's also kind of key in being able to do that empirical work, right? If you picked an industry where most of the firms said, forget it, we're not going to comply. Well, no, I guess, no, then you could still recover. No, that's right. If we're all in the non-comply, you could also kind of recover these estimates. But yes, you're right, that would indicate, that would push you much more to, that would affect kind of where you are on that Laffer curve. Yeah.
Marc?
Yeah.
Although I was privileged to study economics at Rochester with Alan Wallace, most of my comments I'm about to make have to do with doing business internationally rather than what economics tells me. In case what I have to share would be of interest to you for elaboration on this model or applying it to other areas. From the standpoint of new technology and new products, what I have found is that the cost of marketing a new product often exceeds the cost of manufacturing that product. And that is of interest. That's of concern to the company. The second is, in some countries with a large potential domestic market for a new technology product, such as China. Well, there for the last 30 years, if you will manufacture your product there and it's advanced technology, you get, a 20, 25-year virtual monopoly on sales in that economy by introducing your technology there. And that's also a factor to any company choosing a location for a high technology product. Obviously not usually truck engines, but more and more technology is important in consideration, so if that's of any interest.
Yeah, thanks. No, I totally agree that I mean, these fixed costs are going to be very important, and it's kind of a little bit, my answer for how we handle this in this paper is kind of goes back also to the question that George asked, which is we assume that we're observing an equilibrium that was generated by fixed cost. We're not kind of dealing with that by kind of keeping those quantities fixed. One thing that we are moving around is we are moving around kind of quantities that are produced at the different plants. And so we're assuming that there aren't going to be variable, so the fixed costs are fine, but we're assuming that there aren't going to be variable kind of returns to scale that are associated with that. But we have, I mean, in this data set, we don't kind of do a lot with it yet. I mean, a huge proportion of the cars now that are being assembled and increasing at a drastic rate is car assembly in China.
Mark, very nice. And I was wondering, about this Laffer curve. Once you start thinking about it, it seems quite general, in fact. So I was wondering what exactly in the model do you actually need for it? I mean, clearly you need some sort of heterogeneity across firms, which is your delta parameter. But maybe that's all of it, right? I mean, even the, you mentioned the EK structure within firms. I guess you don't need that for the Laffer curve, right?
No, you do. So you do need. So we actually. So this is early on. When we were making conjectures about, would we get a Laffer curve? Would we not? And what do we need for that? These are exactly kind of the things we debated. So you need more than just that. You need the combination of the heterogeneity across firms that you mentioned, and that convexity as you crank up the rule of origin. Because otherwise, kind of what's going to happen is it's not going to be there's just going to be this choice that's not going to depend on the rule of origin because remember, whether you assemble in home or in foreign is not going to depend on the rule of origin. You're going to kind of have if you're not going to comply, you have a preferred kind of location that's not going to depend on the rule of origin. So you need, but this is something we're kind of still working on the intuition that you kind of need at least more than just one part to kind of have this choice to generate the Laffer curve. But that's something that we kind of plan to kind of highlight more that we haven't done yet.
Okay, I see. And I mean, still on this, I mean, is the idea to eventually be able to kind of recover the parameters of the Laffer curve, see like an empirical Laffer curve? Is that the idea?
So what the whole point that we would like to do is, so we want to use the estimates that are coming out of the model to recover essentially the distribution of these key deltas across all these different car models. We have pretty good estimates, right, of the theta based on kind of the response to the tariffs, and to use that then to kind of use the model to tell us, well, what does this Laffer curve look like for the auto industry? Yeah.
So Mark, I'll follow up a little bit on that, and I think it's related to Sam's comments, which is, it seems like you could really get at this like across industries empirically with these rules of origin, right? And so, I mean, I think it's great to do it with the car industry, but we've got big different. You had like those comparative static pictures earlier, right? that sort of showed us like when you get a peak and where the peak is. It just seems like, you know, we could use all the heterogeneity in the data over the last however many years to sort of recover some of these results. Have you thought about doing that, or is there work that sort of looks at that?
You know, we haven't. I mean, we kind of haven't thought about kind of taking that empirically outside of this data set. We were more for some of the early feedback we got, but this is, you know, we still haven't completely integrated the model and the empirics. It's kind of some of the early feedback we got was, well, the model's completely separate from the empirical stuff. You know, they should kind of be separate, and we strongly felt that they should be kind of combined. So we are kind of taking that approach, but I agree that, I mean, it would be interesting to think about what things could look like in other sectors. But you know, our initial focus is really to kind of get something back to the model for the car.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mark, can I go back to that graph you had that had a monotonic curve and then a little triangle on the compliance?
Oh yes, yeah. So this is the rule. This is the rule of origin. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when you make the rules of origin stricter, you move the vertical line to the right.
Yeah. So both of them. Yeah, both of them move to the right. Exactly. Yeah.
And the horizontal line moves up.
And the horizontal line is also going to move up. Yes.
Right. So then both curves. And it's the area, what you lose in terms of value added being done to domestically is a different area.
Yeah, exactly. This is it's the area of this triangle. Exactly. Yes.
And when you allow for mobility of firms, then it is only the firms that are in between the two vertical lines, the old and the new, that potentially move. The other firms would have no incentives to move.
I mean, it's very similar. It's a very similar decision when you allow for the assembly location choice. You just have two ways of non-complying. Here I've only showed you one way of non-complying, right? And so you jump back. So the firm that's right at this threshold here, right? You raise the rule of origin, and it chooses not to comply. And in this example, it's not complying, and it keeps its assembly location in home. When we introduce the endogenous assembly location choice, now you have two decisions. Do I assemble in home or do I assemble in foreign? And when you have trade costs for parts, it's going to matter. That's going to matter where you do that. And additionally, when you have these trade costs for parts, when you switch that assembly location choice, it's going to change it's going to discretely shift the share of parts that you're going to buy from home and from foreign.
Right, and then the area that you would lose in terms of value at home, if the firm chooses to leave home and produce everything abroad, would be the full vertical line for that particular firm.
Not necessarily the whole vertical line, because even if you assemble in foreign,
the firm can still source domestically.
Yeah, so it's really very similar. The intuition is really very similar. You get the same kind of triangle area, but it's a slightly different triangle depending on whether there's only one way to comply, which is you assemble in home, right? There are two ways now of not complying.
Yeah.
And you have to keep track of that, but the intuition is very much the same. You still have this kind of area. It's just exactly what this area is going to depend on how you choose not to comply.
Right. So then the non-compliant firms that move, they have another curve that's lower, which is their production abroad.
Exactly. I mean, so essentially you have two. Yeah, you have two of these. And they intersect at one particular delta. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be cool to have. I think that would be a nice.
Oh yeah, no,
comparative static exercise to illustrate.
Yeah, no, we're definitely planning on that. This is just like, you know, haven't been able to produce that yet for the slides. Yeah, but
right, but I think it would be illustrative of the mechanism.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we plan, yeah. So that's something we definitely want to add, and because also empirically, that's just a big part of the decision, right? So I showed you kind of the example for the German brands that are assembled in NAFTA, like their choice of non-compliance. It's not like they're going to just the key decision for them is going to be, I already have my assembly locations in Europe. In some cases, for like the big cars, think about like for example, the X5, when it was first produced, it was produced exclusively in the US for every car, every version of that they sold to the world, with a few exceptions, right? So they already have demand for that car outside of it. So for them, the decision is, you force me to source my engines and transmissions from my X5 within NAFTA. I'm not going to assemble that. I'm not going to assemble it in the US. I'm going to assemble it elsewhere. And so it's really key to, since that's a key part of the empirics, we definitely want that also reflected in the model. Yeah.
It's super nice. I really like the paper.
Thank you.
So Mark, I'll come back to like at what time horizon we're thinking about these changes, because the idea that BMW is going to sort of shut down their assembly facility in South Carolina, it's sort of hard to believe that would be the response, right? Like you would sort of think that they would take whatever they would actually, shift the parts here. Kind of as you see that these assembly sites, they sort of grow up around the part suppliers grow up around the assembly sites, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, maybe this is like a different decision for Mexico and Canada, but for the US, it just seems like this would, at least for an X5 has that big tariff as well. Like you would sort of expect a lot more to be concentrated in the US. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around like how I should think about that decision.
Yeah, so maybe the X5 is a bad decision because it's assembled in the US and it's sold in the US, so it's not going to be hit. So think of I don't know, I don't know where the Beetles that are assembled in Mexico, kind of where they go, but assuming that there's kind of so maybe that's a better example, right? And
gotcha.
And again, it's not. Clearly some costs are kind of key. So I shouldn't have said it as you're going to move your assembly plan. I know I've said it that way because it's kind of the thing from the regression. But the idea is in a world where the rules of origin are even more binding, or even to think about, does a current level of rules of origin at the margin, are there some cars that Volkswagen is assembling in Europe that it may have assembled in Mexico or Canada? And if it had done that, it would probably be sourcing more of the parts from the US. So is the US just hurting itself by, inducing the rules of origin are going to induce some of them to kind of source the parts from within NAFTA, but they could also be losing out that there could be more assembly in Mexico and Canada that use US made parts. That's not happening because of the rule of origin. So that's really what we want to get at.
So one last question, kind of broader but kind of related to George's point. I mean, I guess in the end, what we want is to, understand whether these rules are good or bad, or something about their optimal level, which is not obvious. Although my reading of this literature is that most people, almost everybody, always think of them as being something bad. Yes, it doesn't need to be. Especially when you think about the relationship between the external tariff and the MFN tariff and the rules of origin. I mean, you mentioned like in your first, I guess within 5 minutes that you wouldn't talk about welfare, but is there a plan to think about, optimal rules or something along those lines?
So, I mean, the issue there is it's really strongly dependent on what you put into. First, you have to put in a distortion, right, for welfare. So in this model, any rule of origin is going to reduce welfare. We have kind of a competitive model, right? So we have to, but regardless of I get one way of putting it is we felt like it was okay if we're emphasizing the backward bending part of it. There's like no kind of, it's kind of like the thing for taxes, right? You can really debate about where we should be on the upward sloping part of the Laffer curve, and anywhere up to even the peak, if you depending on your social welfare function. But there's no kind of model that's going to tell you that being on the backward bending part is good, right? So kind of that's where we were coming from with this. But yeah, for the upward sloping part, then it really kind of depends on what goes into the welfare function. But just to kind of give you an example that would align it a little bit more with the Laffer curves we're showing you, if the model is one that's been used a lot for trade policy, which is this idea that there are markups in this sector and there's an outside sector that has no markups, right? Then what the social planner wants to do is move employment to the markup sector, right? Employment in the markup sector is inefficiently low. To that extent, you can use these comparative statics to say, well, now there's a distortion. The social planner wants to move employment to the auto part sector, and the rule of origin is one way of doing that. And then then you could get in that kind of model, you could get a Laffer curve, a different Laffer curve for welfare. But it's taking a stand on, okay, well, what is a distortion? I mean, the literature has done this, right? Which is you have to take a stand on where that distortion is, and then you have to exclude from the tools that the social planner can use a more direct way of addressing the distortion. So in the example I just gave, what's always going to be first best is going to have a labor policy that's going to move workers into the auto part sector. But subject to those caveats, that's something that we could incorporate here. I'm not sure how much more we could say based on the literature that's already kind of studied this, in a general trade model without rules of origin.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we can probably stop the recording, George.